So I'll now introduce our guest speaker, Dr Margaret Vickers from Inner West Community Energy. Inner West Community Energy is an independent community group formed by local people keen to promote energy efficiency as well as renewable and solar energy in Sydney's Inner West. Their goal is to facilitate investments in community solar projects in the Inner West and to support national community action on solar energy. So tonight, Margaret will be talking about community batteries. And if we're lucky, she might also cover the work being done to get people in public housing access to solar power. Now, there'll be time for questions at the end, so please put any questions that you have in the chat. So over to you, Margaret.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you for inviting me. And again, congratulations to the young women who performed so beautifully. It was terrific to see you and hear you presenting your work. And Ken, thank you for the introduction. Yes, we work with Inner West Community Energy, and they have been focused substantially on installing rooftop solar for over 20 years, and they hadn't, until we contacted them, they hadn't really done much of a focus on community batteries. And we thought this was important to try to start educating the community, bringing people along, making people aware of what community batteries are going to mean and what they can do for us. So Ken, could you just put the first slide on, please? Thanks. So that's our first question. Why do we need them and what can they do for us? And we formed a group under the umbrella of Inner West Community Energy, and we started last year with someone's talking, I think, unless we've got some problems with muting here. Anyway, we started to work last year with the Inner West Council and had a target to put on a large event in the Leichhardt Town Hall. We were aiming to demonstrate levels of community support in order to help the Inner West win a battery when we make application through ARENA. And we were aiming also to ensure that we contacted as many organisations and as many people as possible to make them aware of what community batteries can do. So on May 6th, we managed to muster 160 people into the Leichhardt Town Hall. Maybe some of you were there. And this is really a repetition with a bit of elaboration of what it was that we talked about on that day. So we'll move along. Look, if you look at what's happening with public housing and in contrast with middle class housing, one of the reasons we decided to become passionately involved with this issue is because the amount that you pay for your electricity bill is not directly related to your household income. It's the opposite. In other words, the richer you are, the higher your household income, the less you pay for electricity and other forms of energy. And if you're poor, the poorer you are, the more you pay. Now, that seems really strange because richer people live in larger houses, they have more TVs. So why is it that they're paying less? The reason for that is that they live in better insulated houses, they have more up-to-date appliances and better insulation and so on. And unfortunately, I think the advent of some of the new technologies that are going to help us move to a renewable future are going to accentuate that inequality. I have a neighbour who has 18 solar panels on his roof and a battery, and his winter bill is $100. Close by in Balmain, in the public housing, I know of people who pay $2,000 to $3,000 for their winter bills. They have to be supported by government subsidies in order to just make ends meet. So we got passionately involved in this because we really wanted to try and do what we could to make sure that these new technologies don't increase the inequalities. Now, the revolution that the energy system is undergoing is happening very rapidly. In the last 9 years, 10 power plants have closed. There's 5 left in New South Wales. It's a race. Are we going to have blackouts? These coal-fired plants are closing because they're making a loss, and the companies are just shutting them down. it's a race between how quickly that will happen and how quickly we can put a renewable system in place. So we'll have the next slide. There are two ways that you can go about achieving this shift. One is by building massive infrastructure, huge wind farms, huge solar farms, and of course those big pieces of infrastructure require high tension, high voltage power lines to transfer the energy from the rural areas to the city. It's expensive, it's slow to construct, there are timeline problems, supply line problems. These projects blow out. We know that we heard an announcement about a month ago that Snowy 2 is going to take 2 more years to finish, longer than we expected. So the alternative to, next slide, the alternative to having that kind of massive infrastructure is to have smaller batteries in the cities. This one is actually in Melbourne. It's beautifully painted by local graffiti artists. It looks like 4 large refrigerators, and it doesn't make much noise, and it's sitting in front of an old power plant. So the excess power that's accumulated there can actually be transferred into the transmission, the high voltage transmission lines. Okay, so we'll just look at the next slide because that gives an indication of how a community battery sits in the power structure. So next slide. Yeah, so the concept is one in which you've got a sub-network, maybe 200 homes that form one part of the overall grid. And I say sub-network, you know, basically you think of it like the leaves on a tree. There's major cables and then they get smaller, and then you have a collection of houses that belong to one sub-network. And in a sub-network where maybe 20% of the homes have rooftop solar, it's worth having a battery. If you've got less than 20%, it probably isn't worth it. So then something like you saw in the last photograph is put in place. And on sunny days, power, this arrow makes it look as though there's a wire from the house to the battery. That's not exactly how it works. The power generated on the rooftops goes out into the grid, that smaller part of the grid that represents that network, sub-network, and when that voltage in that section increases, then that voltage is moved into that battery. And at night time, when the sun's not shining, that battery, that power is available to those households. And if more power is generated than those households use overnight, then that power can transfer to the high tension system. Now, there's a really interesting little detail here, and that is on really sunny days, you can generate so much electricity that the voltage in the network rises from 220 up towards 260. And that's the danger. This is the hard part about having the new kind of networks that we're getting. These new networks absorb power from multiple sources. Life was very simple when running an electricity system meant having a dozen big coal-fired generators that you could control that were pushing electricity out into the network from one source. What we've got now is wind, solar, hydro, and other sources, all contributing in chaotic ways to the power in the network. Now, it can be, the rooftop solar can be very, very significant. There have been a couple of days in the last 12 months where there's so much power coming just from the rooftops that all of the big plants were shut down because the economists, the engineers running it, said, well, the price of electricity is negative today because there's so much power come from the rooftops. what does that tell us? Really, that there's just not enough storage systems in place because we've just turned them off. So we do have a pathway to a 100% renewable system. And that pathway means that when all of the solar that we generate is stored, and what that means in the suburbs as the sort of a more rapid and more responsive and quicker way of getting there in comparison with the huge infrastructures we were talking about before, the more rapid way to get there is by having community batteries within sub-networks around particular suburbs. So which suburbs would they be? Well, it would depend on where there's the highest level of rooftop solar. And the other thing it would depend on is whether the grid in that suburb is stable or not stable. Why do we care? Well, what difference will it make? So next slide, please. So it strengthens and stabilizes the power supply, and that's important because we have this kind of chaotic range of inputs, and so instability is part of the new system, of the new world, and therefore we need to have batteries that can help with the stabilization so that you don't have the voltage flying up from 220 up to 260 and melting the whole system down. Sudden increase in voltage, the engineers engage in what's called curtailing. Curtailing means simply blocking the power, stopping it from coming into the system, throwing it away. If we can have more batteries, we'll eliminate the curtailing, and that's really important. We are moving towards electrifying everything. Many of you will be wanting to get electric vehicles. It won't be and additional electricity storage from batteries. So I've been talking about curtailing, and what the second point there is supporting the feed-in tariffs and allowing more solar installations. I've spoken to people who are told, no, Ausgrid won't let you put solar on your roof because it would overload the system. We can't have more installations in your area. It's already full. It's already operating at maximum level. So installation of batteries will solve that problem. We've also seen that over time, the feed-in tariff that you receive has fallen down and down and down from 25 cents down to about 7 cents now. It could be eliminated altogether. If there's a battery in your sub-network, the feed-in tariff will be guaranteed. You'll get it, because there's no, it is not causing your supply of power to the system is not creating a problem. Will this reduce your power bill? That's a big question people keep asking. The more battery storage there is, and I can refer here to large-scale batteries as well as small-scale ones. For example, we know that out in that when Liddell closes, which in fact it has now closed, the Liddell power plant is setting up a massive battery in its location, and that massive battery will be connected to a solar farm, and that makes sense because there's a whole lot of power lines that run from Liddell into the city. So the power that's going to come from that solar farm and from that large battery system will cost much less than coal-fired power has used to cost. So over time, as the government works with power companies to increase the percent renewable, the costs that those companies incur will fall, and there will be very clear guidelines and pressure to bring down electricity bills overall. So that's about it for the slideshow. I'll just go on, Ken, to just get rid of the slides, and I'll comment a bit on what we want to do in relation to public housing. Now, we've been looking at public housing and also at low-income housing, low-income strata rentals. There are particular problems with public housing we've been discovering because some of the buildings are so poorly maintained that you cannot actually add solar systems to them And also there are some difficulties, I think, with concerns that residents of public housing have about any kind of change, that many people find it a pretty threatening thing. And so we are in negotiation to see whether we can do that. Ideally, this is the sort of thing we'd like to do. This, what I'm about to describe, could be done with low income strata rental properties, and that's, I think, going to be the easiest target to achieve, and we'll keep on working on the public housing side as we go down the track. So this is the idea we're working on. Consider that you've got a block that has 35 units in it. Consider that you might put if that block of apartments has preferably a metal roof, corrugated iron roof, with a northerly aspect, and if it's not more than 2 stories high, then you're in luck, because you can get up there without scaffolding and all of those expensive things, and you can get the solar panels onto the roof. And if the residents of that strata housing organisation agree, you can then install a substantial battery, perhaps of the order of 15 kilovolts, inside the close to that apartment block. In some cases, you've got apartment blocks that have an atrium or courtyard. We then put small indicators, small meters on each of the units under a system known as ALLUME, ALLUME. These small meters tell you who's using how much power. And there's really then, for that group of 35 units, there's only one electricity bill. This is called a system that's set up called so-called behind the meter, because the 35 units are behind the single meter that relates to the national network, to the major grid. So it's only on occasions when the whole rooftop solar system, together with the battery, cannot keep up with the amount of power required by those 35 units to purchase any power from the grid. At the same time, a collection of homes, a collection of units in such a strata system would be able to sell power back to the grid, and so you might break even. And we are working with, we've already started to have a conversation with one large strata system that has some of the right characteristics. In fact, its metal roof has got to be replaced in a couple of years from now, and the metal is all going to be taken off and the scaffolding is going to be put up, and the people within that unit are pretty enthusiastic about seeing if they can go down the track I've just described. So I think that might be enough to see if there's any questions and comments about what I've said and about that particular plan at the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there's one. Okay, Rick, if you can put that on gallery so that we can see any questions that people have, that you want to raise their hand as well. So we've got one here in the chat, Margaret, that is, could you comment on the fact that many people think community batteries are similar to household batteries? In other words, houses generate rooftop solar, excess is stored in the community battery, and the houses can access the community battery. But in fact, community batteries support the grid, local and the whole grid, not individual homes. I think this misunderstanding is widespread. It certainly is widespread.
That is a concern that people can't keep on coming back to us, and that it actually encapsulates exactly what I was saying at the end. This, what we call this behind the meter approach, is one where a particular collection of units own a battery, and it's shared by the units, and the power that's generated from that rooftop belongs to them. Whereas what happens with community batteries is that all the power generated within the subnetwork goes to the battery and strengthens the network for everyone. Now, what's the problem is that some people think that's a problem. What I'd be inclined to say in response to that is, if you live in such a suburb that has such a battery and you want to have curbside electric vehicle charging, you won't get it unless there's a community battery in that sub-network. That's just the way it's going to happen. Does that answer the question?
David, you unmute yourself. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. I do think that's a really widespread misunderstanding. I was at the meeting in Leichhardt and there was a couple of questions from people that said, how do I join up and how do I pay and all this stuff? I do think this is just a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
So thank you.
And it's interesting that people get annoyed about, the idea that this community battery doesn't benefit them personally and directly, when in fact the money is not going to come out of their own bank account. This is being paid for partly by the government and partly by the distribution companies like Ausgrid and Endeavour. They are paying for it.
Yes.
It
makes the whole system better.
And it makes the whole system better. Yes. And in fact, if you have solar panels on your own roof and the voltage rises to 230 or 240, the inverter in your system is likely to simply stop working and you won't even get the power from your own roof. Yeah. So in that way, the battery does help you.
Tell us about it, Margaret. That happens to me quite a bit. I have to go out every morning and check that my inverter is still on because it switches off from time to time. Listen, can I just ask a question that's it's a pre-submitted question, and that is, given the increase in prices of these batteries, partly because of the war in Ukraine, that Europe's pushing hard to buy every bit of equipment they can to replace power that was being bought from Putin. Would it be better for the government to actually subsidise the purchase of household batteries rather than put all this money that they're putting into the community batteries? So give a rebate so that homes can put on their own Tesla wall, power wall, rather than spend it on the community batteries. What's your thought on that?
Well, my thought on that is that I think if you look at some of the data that Ausgrid gave us, we at the meeting in Leichhardt, Ausgrid pointed out that the unit cost of household batteries per kilowatt hour is high. So the size of the community battery gives it an economy of scale that makes it much more efficient. They said it's a kind of a sweet spot, in these massive batteries that you might have out where the Dell is, which is Lismore or something, isn't it? No, it's not. It's the other side of the mountains. It's over there anyway. These massive batteries are kind of efficient, but the inefficiency that comes from them is the loss of voltage when you channel that power along the high transmission lines. So relatively large, say 220 kilovolt batteries, relatively large batteries in a local area with with small transmission distances represent a point of high efficiency. Having multiple batteries in individual households doesn't do that, because the batteries, the unit cost of the batteries, given the amount that they're going to achieve, is not that high. The other thing to look forward to is the creation of flow batteries. So these involve liquid electrolytes. Anytime you can have one electrolyte that is a kind of an electron source and another electrolyte that is an electron sink, and you put a semi-permeable membrane of the right kind between the two sets of liquids, you can get a nice flow of power. These will take up more space, but they will be cheaper because they don't depend on lithium, and they're coming. The chemists have got it right. The engineers know how to do it. The commercialization usually takes 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question here from Stephen. If someone would like to get involved in a community battery, what are the steps involved?
Well, okay. Well, I think that the answer to that is that you're in Reid. Okay, so Reid is getting one. It's going to be in Cabarita. it's going to be in Cabarita because the power system in Cabarita is inadequate. And Sanity and her people in her office are really on top of that. So I think in Canada Bay, you should connect up with Sally Situ's office and the people there who are working with the Canada Bay Council, and just push in that direction, because basically it's a relationship between Ausgrid, your local council, and your federal member. And so that's the combination you need to work on if you want to get involved.
Well, we've actually got a representative of Climate Action Burwood-Canada Bay on the committee that's consulting on that battery, but there seems to be some sort of hold up. It seems to have been approved by everybody except perhaps the local residents, because it hasn't gone ahead yet, and I'm not quite sure what the delay on it is.
I was there in Kendall Park about 8 weeks ago, and there was a local, very positive, about, I'd say 40 people.
Yeah, I was there too.
People.
Yeah.
Me too.
So it seemed pretty positive at the time. So I don't know.
It did, but there's still some sort of delay. I think it's not going ahead yet. I don't know what it is, but I'm interested that you said about why they've chosen the site there, because we went to the initial meeting where Chris Bowen announced that it was being put there, and we couldn't work out why it was going there. We thought it might be just for political reasons, but I'm glad to hear that it's not.
What happened, Ken, was there's a conversation we had with a couple of people who were local there. They said the power cables that feed that subnetwork right there are weak, and apparently in one large residential block, people were starting to electrify. 2 different families moved from gas to electricity. They both turned on their stoves to cook their dinner at the same time, and the lifts failed.
Oh no. Right. Yeah, look, I've heard, I went and spoke to the Breakfast Point Club of Probus a few weeks ago, and I had nothing but complaints from people who live right in that area that their power is always failing. So yeah, it backs it all up. Now we've got a question here from Marg. If Ausgrid is the main beneficiary, isn't this another case of transfers from the public purse to private pockets?
Right, that's a classic question.
Ausgrid's 51% privately owned and 49% owned by the state government.
Yes, if only we could go back to, was it 2009 when we sold our public utilities and broke it up into these silos? You could see it as a transfer of money, from taxpayer money to Ausgrid. In some ways, well, the question is, how else are you going to do it? Who owns the poles and wires? You can't build your own poles and wires separately from Ausgrid because, we sold this taxpayers funded entity. It's been privatised. This is the problem we've got. Now, the way I see this working out down the track, you're not going to have the government going on subsidising Ausgrid and giving taxpayers money to Ausgrid to put these batteries in place without some price being paid. And I think the price that will be paid once we get to a higher level of overall renewable is the transmission costs will be brought down. They'll have to be. I mean, Sally Zito in the conversations, those kind of negotiations are going on already.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question here by David. Why does the local community need to approve a community battery? I think I can answer that, being on this committee that's dealing with this community battery. And the answer is it doesn't need to approve it. Ausgrid can just push it through. The local community I don't think has any say whatever. But Ausgrid doesn't want to ram it through. I think they do want to get people on side. And part of the requirement for this government rollout is that there be community consultation and local groups have to be involved in it. So I suspect that that's why this is happening. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Margaret?
Absolutely. I totally agree.
Yep. Now I'm just there.
Can I say something there for a second?
Absolutely, David, go for it.
I think the problem is the name community battery. It should be called a local battery. That's what it is. It's really nothing to do, or hardly anything to do with the community. Thank you.
What would you call it?
Local.
What would you call it?
Local battery.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. 100%. Yep.
We've also discussed that amongst ourselves and thought that even neighbourhood would be better than community battery.
I've actually got one of the questions that was given in advance was, are community batteries wrongly named? So that's exactly the same question as David's one. I think the answer is yes, they are.
I mean, we don't name all the power lines and power poles in the community, but they're just as much community assets as this. I just think it's very misleading.
Yes. Do we know, Margaret? I've heard Chris Bowen say that we're going to need thousands of these community batteries. I think he quoted a figure like something like 10,000 or something. I mean, do you have any idea of how many of these we're going to need?
Well, I don't think anyone can say exactly, because what I've heard from talking to a person who is in AEMO is that there's a kind of an argument going on inside AEMO between what they call utility scale equipment and local equipment. And utility scale is this sort of mega farms of solar and huge wind farms and huge batteries, huge storage systems associated with that. And the other side of it is, rooftop solar, small scale neighbourhood batteries, shared facilities. The kind of strata unit I'm talking about that we're talking with. We don't know. We're in a very unstable and preliminary sort of stage, and we don't know where it's going to land. We don't know what percentage of all the stored power in New South Wales are going to be in mega batteries, maybe on the other side of the Blue Mountains, or 70 kilometres from the city, or what percentage of the overall storage capacity is going to be dotted around the suburbs in smaller installations. It isn't clear yet where it's going to come out.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got a question here from Billy Ailing. She says there's a possible proposal for a battery in Strathfield involving large installations rather than households. For example, the Flemington markets. And I think you're referring to the one that Jason Yatsen-Lee's putting forward, aren't you, Billy?
Yeah.
Okay. And she says, can you discuss the different models of community batteries and their relative merits?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that the Ausgrid people at the Leichhardt seminar talked about that. And I think there is a desire to have some really big ones. And we would rather I've heard about Jason Yatsen-Lee's ideas, and I think they're good ones. And we also think, for example, if you look at White Bay, where the cruise terminals is and the big cruise ships come in, spewing nasty diesel fumes all over us, we would like to see the rooftops of the whole cruise terminal area and the old container structures turned into a shoreline solar farm, and shorter ship power generated through renewables with a battery that might feed inwards in and out of the ship's batteries. I mean, this is just blowing in the wind at the moment. This idea, it doesn't have any official status, but it is the kind of thing we should look at. And the larger projects, not these little projects.
Stephen's just made a comment here. I think it's a really good one. Let's call these batteries local batteries from now on. So even if the government and Ausgrid might insist on calling them community batteries, we should start referring to them as just local batteries, so that at least the people we're talking to are not confused about what they do.
Yeah. I mean, the only sense in which they're communities is that they're not privately owned. And that's the distinction. But yes, it could be. I think neighbourhood gives that kind of idea of it being local, but not kind of owned by the community.
Oh,
So,
yeah, neighbourhood batteries is not a bad name. Do you know anything about the Yakandanda battery system they've got down there?
oh yeah, Yakandanda is a special place.
Okay, well, can you tell us about it? I know Yakandanda, but I don't know anything about the battery. That was before my time.
Okay. Yeah, so Yakandanda, the people is very cohesive little community. I suppose about 600 people in the beautiful mountains east of Wangal, and they decided that they wanted to do their own thing in a big way. They created an electricity company called Indigo Power. Some generous farmer donated access to half a dozen large barns, and they got a grant from the Victorian government. They covered that whole space with solar, and then they raised money and got a further grant, and they put in a battery. So basically, they are like a town that's behind the meter. The homes of Yakandanda are linked to this large battery that was subsidised by the Victorian government, and the whole of Yakandanda only purchases power from the national or from the East Coast grid when the sun hasn't shined for a really long time.
Okay, we've got a question here from Stephen. He says, let's say there is a public building, for example, a library or a church, that has a backup diesel generator. Would it be possible for the owner of that building to propose replacing that diesel generator with a local battery that the local residents could contribute towards?
Well, that's a brilliant idea. I mean, that's exactly, what we should be doing. And that's why here in Balmain, we're arguing that instead of having diesel generators providing all the power for the cruise ships and creating massive and dangerous pollution, we should really have a big renewable system, a big, a photovoltaic system across the whole roof of the cruise terminal. It's really important to do that.
And we'll probably have to finish up very soon, but there's a question here from Kyle. He says, so the idea of the batteries is to have many smaller, in the grid sense, scale energy storage units that provide energy to the local area and surrounding energy areas as it's needed. Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. And I don't think we need to see a battery in every sub-network. I mean, when we talk about a sub-network, we're talking about 200, 300 houses. So if you said that the whole of the East Coast, maybe the West Coast too, but maybe just say the whole of the East Coast was only going to be managed through these local community batteries, then take the total number of houses and divide it by 200 or 300 and see how many. It would be a very big number. It's not going to be like that because some sub-networks will be unstable. Some sub-networks will have more blackouts than others, like Picnic Point and Cabarita, and they will be the first. It's relatively low. It's not very high income. It's modest in income. It's got 30% saturation with PV, and it's got instability. So these neighbourhood or local arrangements will be targeting those kind of places straight up. And then in terms of the overall supply of power across the East Coast, we're going to be, dependent as well on some big battery installations. I hope that answers the question.
And the comment below is sounds sweet. Sweet sounds like a stable system which has no one single point of failure. Any more than that can be said about it. Okay. Well, look, I think
that's a nice point. That's a really good point. I mean, that's where this kind of multiple points of stabilisation is so important and so different from the past.
Okay. Oh, look, I've got another one here from Stephen, and then we probably will have to wrap it up fairly soon. So Stephen says, let's say there's a public, oh, sorry, we've got that one already. Okay, I was just being read again. Okay. Oh, no, here's something else. Billy says, the introduction of smart meters for household appliances will allow people to use more of their generated electricity. Hot water systems via heat pumps combined with smart meter might be likely. Will smart meters reduce the need for community batteries?
Smart meters will make it possible for us to win the race. You know, when I say it's a race between how quickly all the existing coal-fired power plants will close and when we get enough power out of a renewable system to make that unnecessary. You know, the tragic possibility is that we will find that we are facing blackouts unless we start to use gas instead of coal. We don't want to go there. In order to match up the amount of energy generated with the amount of energy required, we're going to have to use less energy. We're going to have to insulate our homes, install smart appliances, or if we can't and don't have smart appliances, work out how to turn on our washing machines and so on when the sun is actually on our panels. We must use less as well as make more renewable energy.
Great. Well, I think we might draw this to a close. And thanks very much, Margaret. We've had some great guest speakers at our members' meetings. We've had Andrew McIntosh talking about carbon credits. We've recently had Professor David Caroli talking about the temperature record. We've had Tim Buckley giving us updates on, he's spoken several times here, and yours has been among the best of them. It was very, very interesting, and we thank you very much.